Hey guys, so we're going to go ahead and cover our last of the four major groups of macromolecules. This one is my favorite group. This is the proteins. Okay, so as we go ahead and start looking at proteins, we have to realize that this is probably the largest of the groups. Okay, there are a lot of molecules that make up all the different groups that we've talked about, but this may be one of the biggest. Um, as a biochemist by trade, this is my favorite group because proteins do so many different things, and I hope that by the time we're done here, you guys have some appreciation for just how amazing proteins are. Okay, so what are our essential questions for today? Number one, what is the basic structure of an amino acid? Okay, this is going to be our monomer as we go ahead and start looking at proteins. And then we got to start thinking about how we take those and turn them into something that we can go ahead and use as a protein. And that means knowing the structure of the protein itself. So, question two, what are the alpha and beta sheets and how do they relate to protein structure? We'll try and go ahead and show you. I have a demonstration I typically do in class, but we don't have the materials here at home. So, I'll try and demonstrate in another way. And then question number three, what are the different groups of proteins based on their function, and give an example of each. I'm not going to expect you to know all the different groups of proteins and all the things they do because it is quite a list. But you should realize that basically anything that the other groups don't do, proteins do it. Okay? Um, so let's go ahead and jump into it. We now have covered, by the time we finish today, four different groups of organic compounds. Remember, to be these organic compounds, that means they're primarily made out of what element? If you said carbon, you're right. Okay. 70% of your body approximately is water by weight, but the rest of it is primarily focused around these carbon based compounds, and there are millions of them. So we've gone over all four groups now. Today we'll do proteins. Last class we did nucleic acids, and the previous class before that we did carbohydrates and lipids. Okay, now when we go ahead and start looking at proteins, proteins are the polymer, and they are made up of a smaller subunit known as an amino acid. This is the monomer. Proteins are made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. That's right, all six of the organic elements that I identified for you. Okay, this is the only group that uses all six. All right, when we go ahead and start looking at nucleic acids, for example, from last class, you still have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, because that's in all of them. You have nitrogen and phosphorus as well. And you actually have more nitrogen in your nucleic acids. But this is the only group that also includes the sulfur. Proteins perform a vast array of functions within living organisms, including catalytic, metabolic reactions. So we're thinking about breaking things down, helping to speed up chemical reactions, replicating DNA. That's right. Your DNA, as important as it is, can't even copy itself without an assist from a protein. This helps us to respond to stimuli in the environment. This helps us to transport molecules from one location to another. Hemoglobin is an excellent example, helping us move oxygen through our bloodstream. Enzymes, nucleic acid copying, transport, you name it, most of the jobs done inside your body, inside your cells, are carried out by proteins. So let's go ahead and start by taking a look at the structure of an amino acid. Now, amino acids are named because they have an amino group. So if you take a look right here, this NH2, this is an amino group. This is where the name amino acid comes from. You'll see that once again, we have a central carbon. This is the center atom that holds it together, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4 covalent bonds, which is what makes carbon so special. Over on this side, you're going to have your carboxyl group, free hydrogen here, and then the last part is this R group. Now you'll notice it says general structure here because this R group actually changes depending on which amino acid you're dealing with. Okay, so the amino group, the carboxyl group, the carbon, the hydrogen, those will stay the same for every amino acid. The only part that actually changes is this R group right here. and there are over 20 different amino acids found in nature. Okay, now there's the generalized structure on the left there again, but now I'm showing you two actual examples of amino acids. The first one is alanine, and you'll notice here we've got a methyl group coming off here, CH3. This is very similar, but notice that there's an oxygen in here, and that one addition can change the property of the amino acid and how it performs in the body. So, once again, proteins do so many different things. They help to carry out chemical reactions, transport small molecules in and out of cells. They help you fight disease. Yes, they're part of your immune system. Some proteins control the rate of chemical reactions and regulate cell processes. Some are used to form bones and muscles. If you start looking at your fingernails or you're playing with your hair right now as you're listening to this, those are primarily made out of proteins. So there are just a laundry list of all the cool things that proteins do. So let's start looking a little bit more at the structure of those proteins. How do they do so many different jobs? So if you take a look at this particular protein, this is just kind of a generic one so that you can get an idea. This is the protein itself. You can see all these different structures, this like corkscrew piece here, these kind of back and forth pieces here. When we go ahead and start looking at this, we have a beta sheet, which is this flat part in here. Okay. You also have your alpha helices, which are these kind of coiled pieces over here. Those are secondary structures of a protein. Proteins actually have 4 different levels of structure. Well, most of them do. There are some that only have 3. The structure of a protein starts out with simply the sequence of amino acids. So if you take a look up here, phenylalanine, glutamic, here, serine, isoleucine, methionine, alanine, serine, so on and so forth. These are the amino acids themselves, and these amino acids have a specific order that determines how that protein is going to fold up. Just the sequence itself is the primary structure of the protein. This is what's also known as a polypeptide chain, and we'll talk more about this when we do transcription and translation towards the end of the semester. Once that structure is cut loose after being manufactured, it begins to fold upon itself. The initial folds form those beta sheets, okay, and form those alpha helixes that we just talked about. These structures make up the secondary structure of the protein. Okay. Once you have primary and secondary structure established, then you start seeing the different alpha helices, the different beta sheets all fitting together to make the final subunit structure. Now for your smaller proteins, this may be it. This may be the end of the protein. But for a larger molecule like the hemoglobin we're showing here in our example, there are actually 1, 2, 3, 4 subunits that work together to make the hemoglobin molecule work. Okay, so when we go ahead and think about this, we've got our primary structure, which is just the sequence of amino acids. We have our secondary structure, which is going to be, in this case, an alpha helix, but could be a beta sheet. How those all fit together is going to be the tertiary structure. Okay, now remember, for smaller molecules, this is it. They often stop after tertiary structure. But for your larger molecules, they're going to need quaternary structure, which comes down here and has multiple subunits. Okay? All right. So when we go ahead and start looking at these structures, remember that the overall structure has 4 levels of complexity. The first one is simply the sequence itself. The sequence then is going to begin to fold into alpha helices and beta sheets. That's your secondary structure. Your alpha helices and beta sheets are then going to fold together and make up a single subunit, and that will be tertiary structure, which is all there is for our simple molecules. But for our more complex molecules, you're going to have multiple subunits, and that will go into what we call quaternary structure. All right. Here's the slide. If you still need to go over that, you can go and pause it here to get this material down. The last thing I wanted to go ahead and highlight before kind of reviewing some of what we've gone over so far in these 3 class periods is the different protein functions. And this is where I kind of get a little excited because there's so many things that proteins do. The first one is your structural. proteins. Okay, these are the ones that actually help build up structures in your body. Examples of these include collagen or keratin. Okay, now a good example of this is the collagen. Right, you may have heard of people who get collagen injections. Okay, they put it in to kind of fill out the skin or give their lips more full look. But collagen is what starts to naturally break down in your body as you age. This is why I have more wrinkles on my face than you do, because as I've aged, my collagen begins to break down. When you start looking at keratin, keratin is what's going to go ahead and build up your fingernails and make up your hair. The next group is one of my favorite groups. This is the regulatory group. You guys probably know more about this than you realize. These are your hormones. Okay, insulin, glucagon, adrenaline, human growth hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. These are all examples of regulatory hormones. Okay, so these are controlling functions that these hormones perform, or these proteins. Okay, because remember, hormones in many cases are proteins. You have your contractile proteins. So if you're writing something down or even typing on your computer right now, in both cases, you're moving. Those movements are possible because of proteins like myosin and actin, which allow for the movement of the muscles in your body. You have your immunological proteins. These are the ones that help to fight invading microbes or other things that are kind of attacking your body, so gamma globulin or something like that. We have our transport proteins. Which act as carrier molecules. These are going to help move the hemoglobin, or as an example of this, so move oxygen around in your body, but you've got myoglobulin. There's a whole bunch. You also have your catalytic proteins. These are what are known as your enzymes. We'll talk a little bit more about these in a different group because they perform a very important role. Amylase, lipase, lactase, trypsin, these are all examples of catalytic proteins that help to speed up chemical reactions, make them more efficient. That's just a small sampling to give you guys a taste of just all the things that proteins do. All right. I hope you guys really just appreciate just how amazing the diversity of proteins is and all of the amazing jobs that they perform for us. So we have our macromolecules. We should know that macro at this point means large. And so macromolecules are your polymers. These polymers are going to be made up of several smaller pieces known as monomers. Remember, poly means many and mono means one. So each macromolecule is going to have a smaller subunit that builds it. So let's take a look at a comparison of the 4 different macromolecules. Day 1, we did carbohydrates and lipids. Okay, the monomer for a carbohydrate is sugar. Whether it's a monosaccharide or a disaccharide, these are these smaller subunits. We then begin to chain them together, and as you chain them together, they form the polymer. Starch being the most common, could be glycogen or cellulose, but these are the bigger pieces. Then we talked about lipids. This is your fats, your oils, your waxes, okay? Things like cholesterol fall into this category. That's kind of the monomer, although remember we said that that's not a perfect term to kind of describe this because they're pretty big themselves. And then the polymer term that we typically use would be a lipid. The group that we did last class was the nucleic acids. Now this includes your DNA and RNA. They are made up of smaller subunits known as nucleotides. Those nucleotides have different bases on them, but they still have a sugar, phosphate, and a base. Those connect together to create your nucleic acid, whether it's RNA or DNA. And then today we just went over your proteins very quickly, but the monomer or small subunit in this case is the amino acid, which helps to build the protein. So let's think about the actual elements that build them and start thinking about the jobs that some of these things do. All right, so we talked about 6 elements that actually make up organic molecules in bulk. The 3 most common ones are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. These are found in all 4 of the organic molecule groups. They are very spread out in specific ratios, CH2O for your carbohydrates. That's part of where the name carbohydrate comes from. C, carbon, H2O, hydrate. So it's some some variation on that theme. This includes your sugars, your starches, your cellulose, your glycogen. We have a similar makeup, CHO, for lipids, but there tends to be less oxygen, which should make some sense because remember, we are converting those carbohydrates that we do not use, we do not exercise enough to use that energy source, and we convert it into long-term storage in the form of lipids or fats. Last class, we went over nucleic acids, which uses most of them. We add nitrogen and phosphorus. Remember, when we start looking at the sugar phosphate backbone, there's your phosphorus and the phosphate. And then the nitrogen is nitrogenous bases. These are the latter rungs of the nucleic acids. The last group that we went over today is the proteins. This is the only group that uses all of them. Sulfur plays an important role in proteins creating what are called disulfide bridges. If you go further on in biology, I'm sure you'll learn more about them. If you take organic chemistry in the future, I'm sure you'll go ahead and talk more about that there as well. So when we start looking at proteins, they don't use as much phosphorus as you see in the nucleic acids, but it is there from time to time. And so this is the only group that actually has all of them in it. So I might encourage you to remember the acronym I gave you earlier on, CHONPS, CHOMPS. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. These are our important organic elements that we find in our macromolecules. The last thing for today is the actual jobs themselves. Carbohydrates' primary job is as energy storage. You do find them as receptors and the structure of plant cell walls, but its main function is energy storage. When we start looking at lipids, lipids' primary job is for membrane structure. When we start looking at the cell membrane next week, you'll notice that it's primarily made up of lipids, a particular lipid called a phospholipid. But they're also for long-term energy storage, insulation, cushioning, so they perform other jobs as well. Then we talked about the nucleic acids, which really only have one job, and that is information storage and transfer. They are there for heredity. This is the instructions, and while the instructions don't do anything, they're the instructions to build and do everything. Think about them like blueprints. You wouldn't want to build a building without blueprints, or you might make some big mistake. This is part of what allows you to grow and develop without having a ton of problems. And then the last group from today is your proteins. Everything that's not on the previous lists for carbs, lipids, and nucleic acids is protein job. Okay, proteins really do so much. Okay, guys, that's it for this one. Hope you're doing well. I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.